The clock blinked to 30 a.m. in the darkness of the kitchen, its green digital glow casting a faint light over the cold granite countertop. Simone stood frozen, eyes fixed on the numbers. Time felt irrelevant tonight, as it had for weeks now. Her husband, Ethan, hadn't come home in hours, and it was no longer a matter of surprise, it was just the next step in a slow unraveling that had been inevitable for months. There was no proof she needed, no evidence left to gather. She had long stopped looking for it. It was a gut feeling now, a deep, gnawing certainty that consumed her. It wasn't the betrayal she had been waiting for that stung so much, it was the recognition that her silence had been mistaken for weakness. She had spent years building a life with Ethan, a life that seemed perfect from the outside. Their high-rise condo in the heart of the city, the dinners at upscale restaurants, the vacations they'd taken to far-flung destinations. All of it had been bought with time, effort, and compromise. But what had she truly built? A life of comfort that had slowly morphed into a gilded cage, a place where she no longer recognized the man she had married. It was easier now to count the ways Ethan had become a stranger than to count the ways he'd once been her partner. His scent, the soft, reassuring smell of sandalwood she had once lovingly picked out for him at the boutique, was now replaced by the overpowering fragrance of cheap cologne. He had stopped pretending he was the man she'd married long ago. And tonight, he wasn't even pretending to be sorry. As she stood by the window, her arms tightly crossed, the door to the foyer suddenly burst open. Ethan stumbled in, flushed with alcohol, his eyes glazed over. The familiar scent of whiskey and cheap perfume clung to him like a second skin, announcing his arrival in a way that made her stomach turn. He seemed oblivious to the stillness in the room, to the oppressive silence she had carefully cultivated. She could see it now, the arrogance in his every step. He was wearing a tailored suit, the kind that had always made him look the part of a successful businessman, but tonight it felt like a costume, a farce. The top-to-buttons of his shirt were carelessly undone, and his expensive cologne lingered in the air like a cheap promise. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a smirk. His voice thick with the remnants of liquor. Simone didn't respond. She just stood there, her expression neutral, watching him with the same cold detachment she had perfected over the past months. She had no energy left for confrontation, no need to shout or beg for an explanation. The man who had once filled her heart with love was long gone. This version of Ethan was nothing more than a shell of the man she had married. A man who now stood before her like a shadow of his former self, his eyes, bleary from the whiskey, narrowed slightly as he approached her, his lips curling into an arrogant smile. "So, what now?" he asked, as if daring her to give him a reason to care. But there was no anger in her eyes, no tears waiting to fall. Just the deep, unshakable calm that had taken root in her heart after months of silent watching, of waiting for the inevitable to unfold, for months. She had kept track of his every move, every phone call, every excuse. She knew the times he came home late, the way he smelled when he walked in the door, the stories he told that never quite made sense. But none of it mattered anymore. She had stopped hoping, stopped trying to change the man who had broken their vows. In her silence, she had found something stronger than love. She had found resolve. Ethan didn't know it yet, but he was living on borrowed time. A part of her wanted to scream at him, to let him have it, to tell him that she knew everything, that she had seen the signs all along, and now she was done. But instead, she just took a slow, deliberate breath, watching as he strolled past her, oblivious to the tension hanging thick in the air. She had already accepted that words no longer mattered. This silence, the one that stretched between them like an impenetrable wall, was more powerful than any words she could speak. She wasn't his wife anymore. She was a witness, a spectator, waiting for him to make the next move. For the truth of his betrayal to come crashing down. Simone had been waiting for this moment for months, the moment when her patience would no longer be mistaken for weakness. The moment when she would stop being the supportive wife and become something far more dangerous. Ethan had no idea what was coming next. The tension in the room thickened, and Ethan finally broke the silence with an exasperated sigh. "I'm not in the mood for this, Simone," he muttered, his words slurred. "Can't you just be a little more understanding for once?" Simone didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Instead, she simply tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp and unyielding. The man in front of her, this version of him, was nothing more than a caricature. Ethan had once been the man she trusted with everything, but now he was just a shell. The arrogant businessman who believed his wealth and charm could shield him from the consequences of his actions had no idea how much danger he was truly in, and as much as it pained her to admit it. She had to face the reality. Ethan was the anchor that had weighed her down for far too long. What would happen when Simone finally decided to sever the ties that bound her to this man? The man who thought he could have it all without consequences. Ethan had no idea just how much he had underestimated her. Simone stood motionless as Ethan approached, his eyes clouded with self-satisfaction. He reached out as if to touch her arm, but she stepped back with a barely perceptible shake of her head. His hand fell to his side. The arrogance that had once captivated her now seemed laughable, weak. He didn't know it, but his world was crumbling around him, and she was the one with the final say. Simone remained silent, her gaze unwavering. Ethan seemed almost annoyed by her lack of reaction. He wanted a confrontation, a fight, something to fuel his own narrative of being misunderstood. But tonight, she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. He had always thrived on drama, on the tension between them. For him, the chaos was just another form of control. But she wasn't his pawn anymore. She was done. "You really think this is it, don't you?" he muttered, his voice a mix of frustration and false bravado. "You think you've got me figured out, that you can just pull away and make me beg for your attention? Newsflash, Simone, I don't need you. I've never needed you." Simone's lips barely twitched. The words hit her, but not in the way he expected. She wasn't heartbroken. She wasn't angry. She was calm, a calm that would have terrified him if he could see it for what it was, a woman who had already let go of the illusion of their marriage. He wasn't the anchor that held her down anymore. He was the weight she was finally going to shed. For the longest time, she had tried to be everything he needed. She had been the supportive wife, the one who gave everything to their shared future while he played his games. But now, standing there in the dim light of their lavish apartment, she realized how hollow their shared life had become. It was no longer about love or loyalty. It was about survival. And Ethan didn't realize it yet, but the rules had changed. Simone turned her back on him without a word and walked toward the hallway, her every step measured, deliberate. The sound of her soft cashmere robe brushing against the cool marble floors echoed in the silence. The faint click of her heels was the only sound in the room, punctuating the weight of the moment. Behind her, she could hear him muttering angrily, trying to provoke a reaction. But she wasn't listening anymore. She stepped into the bedroom, shutting the door behind her with a soft click. She didn't need to hear his drunken words anymore. She didn't need him to apologize, to promise change. The man who had once been her partner was no more. He had taken so much from her, her trust, her love, and her peace of mind. But now she was taking it all back. The silence in the apartment stretched on. The late hour didn't help the heavy feeling in the air. Simone sat at the edge of the bed, staring out at the sprawling city below. The lights of the skyline twinkled like 1,000 distant promises, but there was only one promise that mattered now. Ethan was about to lose everything. His world was about to come crashing down, and it was all going to start with the very foundation he had tried so hard to hide. Simone had already seen the cracks in their life long before tonight. They had been there for months, small, subtle hints that something was wrong. The late nights, the whispered phone calls, the strange absences. She had known, deep down, that their marriage was built on a lie. But now she had the proof she needed. And Ethan had made the fatal mistake of underestimating her, of thinking that she would always be the quiet, patient wife who stood by him. She was done being quiet. She had spent years silently supporting his career, his ambitions, his ego. But she had never once asked for anything in return. Now all of that was about to change. Ethan's deception, his arrogance, his lies, they would all come crashing down. And she was going to make sure of it for the next few days. Ethan went about his routine, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He still had his high-profile real estate deals, his flashy lifestyle, his network of contacts. He still believed that the success he had built for himself was untouchable, that his reputation and wealth were impenetrable. But Simone had learned something during their marriage, something he would never understand. Power wasn't about wealth or status. It was about control, and right now, Simone was in full control. She wasn't the desperate, broken woman he thought she was. She was the strategist, the planner, the woman who had been quietly gathering the pieces to bring him down. And she wasn't going to stop until every part of his carefully constructed world fell apart one evening. As Ethan sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, the weight of his arrogance still evident in his posture, Simone quietly slipped out of the room. He didn't notice her leave. He never did any more. She walked to her study, where she had kept her old burner phone hidden for months. It had been buried beneath layers of old paperwork, just out of Ethan's reach. He had no idea that she still had access to everything he had tried so hard to hide. And now she was going to use it. Her fingers moved quickly as she dialed the number of one of Ethan's clients, a man named Marcus, who had trusted Ethan with a huge deal. Simone knew the deal was about to go through, but there was something Ethan hadn't told Marcus, something critical that could completely ruin him. It wasn't just a minor flaw. It was a structural defect in the property that Ethan had conveniently overlooked. But Simone had discovered it. She had seen the hidden reports, the details that Ethan had buried deep to avoid liability. As the phone rang, Simone's heart beat steadily, the calmness she had cultivated now firmly in place. The moment that would shift everything had arrived. The connection clicked, and Marcus's voice came through the line. "Simone, thank God we got you," Marcus said, his voice filled with confusion and urgency. "We got your message. What's going on? Is there something we need to know about the property?" Simone didn't waste time on pleasantries. "The deal for the Stonehaven estate is off. Ethan is a fraud. Call me tomorrow at exactly 9 a.m. Do not sign anything. I have irrefutable evidence regarding the foundation and its deliberate concealment." She hung up without another word, slipping the phone back into her pocket. There was no need for emotion, no need for grand gestures. The evidence would speak for itself. And Ethan, for all his pride, would be powerless to stop it. By morning, Ethan was oblivious to the fact that his world was starting to fracture. He believed the deal for the Stonehaven estate was still intact. He believed Simone was still the wife who blindly supported him, the woman who would forgive him yet again. But Simone had already made her move. And this time, there would be no forgiveness. The city was still asleep when Simone woke up that morning. She had never been a morning person, but today, everything felt different. The air around her seemed charged with anticipation, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. She moved through the motions of her routine with practiced precision, showering, dressing in a sharp business suit, and taking a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee as she stared out of the kitchen window. The sun was still low on the horizon, casting a pale light across the city. And for a moment, everything seemed almost peaceful. But deep down, Simone knew this was just the calm before the storm. By the end of the day, everything would have changed. Ethan, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware of the chain of events already set in motion. He had woken up late, as he often did after a night of drinking, but he didn't let it faze him. He stretched lazily in their bed, the faint memory of Tiffany's perfume still clinging to his skin. He smiled at the thought of her, his escape, his prize. He hadn't seen her in days, but the idea of her waiting for him, eager for his attention, made him feel like he was still on top of the world. He wandered into the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee, only half listening to Simone as she spoke to him about a few things she needed to take care of that day. She wasn't upset, wasn't emotional. She was just going about her day with that same unnerving calm he had been noticing more and more recently. It unsettled him, but he brushed it off. He had bigger things to focus on, like the deal he was closing in a few hours. Simone knew what was coming. Her mind had been working steadily overnight, calculating every move, anticipating every response from Ethan. She had already started the process. But today was the day she would execute her final step. The call she had made to Marcus last night was only the beginning. The pieces were now in motion. She was about to bring everything crashing down, and Ethan had no idea. The foundation of his carefully constructed empire was about to crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. Simone stepped out of the apartment with a quiet determination. She had set everything in place, but she knew she couldn't be there to watch it unfold. That wasn't the point. The point was to let Ethan feel the weight of the consequences of his actions, to realize just how deep his deception had run, and how utterly alone he was now. She wasn't doing this for revenge. She was doing it for justice. And justice didn't need to shout. It just needed to be delivered. Ethan, however, was still wrapped in his cocoon of self-satisfaction. He had no idea that the storm was already brewing. His phone buzzed on the counter, and he picked it up lazily, expecting a message from Tiffany or one of his colleagues. But it wasn't. It was a message from Marcus, one of his high-profile clients. Ethan frowned as he read the message. The deal for Stonehaven is off. Simone contacted us with proof of a concealed defect in the property's foundation. Call me if you want to discuss it. The words hit him like a slap to the face. He immediately dialed Marcus's number, his pulse quickening as he tried to make sense of what he was reading. Simone had known that Ethan would panic, and she had prepared for it. She had anticipated his calls, his desperate attempts to save the deal. She could already hear his voice, frantic, pleading, trying to explain away the evidence that had been carefully laid out in front of him. He wouldn't be able to hide behind his lies anymore. He couldn't charm his way out of this one. The phone rang, and Marcus answered on the second ring. "Ethan, you've got some explaining to do. What is this about the foundation?" "We've already had our structural engineer confirm what Simone said. This is serious. If you don't have a valid explanation for this, we're pulling out of the deal." Ethan tried to keep his voice steady, but there was no masking the panic creeping into his tone. "There must be some mistake," he said quickly, grasping at straws. "I was going to tell you about the issues with the foundation, but it wasn't the right time. I had planned to negotiate a discount after the sale. This is all just a misunderstanding, but Marcus wasn't having it." "Ethan, don't insult my intelligence. Simone sent us everything, detailed reports, proof that you knew about the structural defects and decided to hide it. You were going to sell us a house that was barely standing. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you've lost my trust. The deal is off." Simone had anticipated Ethan's attempt to deny everything, to try and save face. But in the end, it wasn't about saving face anymore, it was about exposure. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back now. She felt a wave of satisfaction wash over her, but there was no triumph in it. It wasn't about victory, it was about restoring balance, about taking back what was rightfully hers. And this was just the beginning. Ethan had spent so long building his empire on lies, but now it was all coming down. At that moment, Ethan's world began to crack. He had thought he could handle anything, he had always been the one in control. But now, with his back against the wall, he realized just how fragile everything was. His reputation, his career, his marriage, all of it was unraveling before his eyes. And the worst part, he had no one to blame but himself. Simone had known that Ethan would fight back, would try to salvage what little he could. But it didn't matter anymore. The evidence was clear, and the truth was undeniable. This was his reckoning, and he had brought it upon himself. Now, she just had to wait for him to realize that his carefully constructed world of wealth and power was built on sand. Ethan continued to make frantic calls, his voice growing more desperate with each passing minute. He called Adrienne, his boss, and begged for a chance to explain himself. But there was no sympathy in Adrienne's voice when he answered the phone. "You've ruined everything, Ethan," he said coldly. "You're done. We're pulling out of the deal. You're finished." Simone had expected Ethan to fight, to lash out, but what she hadn't expected was how fast his world would crumble. Within hours, everything he had worked for began to slip through his fingers. His reputation was shattered, his career in jeopardy, and his marriage on the brink of collapse. But for Simone, it was a moment of quiet satisfaction, the kind that came with knowing she had finally taken control of her life. Ethan had always seen her as the anchor, the one who would never leave. But now she was the one pulling up the anchor, cutting the ties that had bound her to him. This was only the beginning. Simone knew that her journey was far from over. There would be more steps to take, more challenges to face. But for the first time in years, she felt the weight of her old life lifting. Ethan had underestimated her, thinking she was just a quiet, patient woman who would always forgive him. But now he was the one who would have to answer for his actions. The storm had begun, and there was no turning back. The following days were a blur for Ethan, the once confident luxury real estate broker who had once prided himself on his smooth talk and razor-sharp deals. Now found himself scrambling to hold on to the pieces of his disintegrating life. His calls were unanswered, his messages ignored, and his reputation tarnished beyond repair. Every attempt to salvage the deal for Stonehaven only dug him deeper into the hole. His clients were angry, his colleagues were distancing themselves, and worst of all, Simone had quietly disappeared into her own world, completely detached from the chaos he had unleashed. Simone had been preparing for this moment for months, carefully watching, calculating every move. She had known that Ethan would try to downplay the situation, that he would beg for her forgiveness, or try to manipulate his way out of the consequences. But she was resolute now. She had seen him for what he truly was, a man so blinded by his own ego and arrogance that he never even realized the ground beneath him had been crumbling for years. She had already begun taking the necessary steps to secure her future. The first was the final severance of their financial ties. The mortgage on the condo was in both their names, but Simone had the leverage now. She had her own sources of income, a strong financial foundation that Ethan never fully understood. But the most important step, one that would hit him hardest, was her final move in the division of their shared assets. The day Simone walked into the lawyer's office, she felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't satisfaction, it wasn't revenge. It was simply clarity. She had spent far too many years in a marriage where her presence had been taken for granted, where her worth had been defined by her relationship to Ethan and not her own ambitions. But now, that was all changing. She was about to take back control of her life, and Ethan would have to watch it happen. She had already begun making plans for a future free of his influence, a future she had quietly prepared for while he basked in his success and wealth. The lawyer, Charles Avery, sat across from her at his polished desk, his expression professional, almost calm. He had seen this kind of divorce before: the betrayed wife, the arrogant husband who thought he could manipulate the system and walk away unscathed. But Simone wasn't like the other wives he had worked with. There was a quiet strength to her, certainty that unnerved him in the best way. "We've gathered all the necessary documents, Simone," Charles said, tapping his pen against the stack of papers. "Your husband's assets have already been seized. We've divided the property and the business holdings as outlined in your request." Simone nodded, her face impassive. "Good," she replied, her voice smooth. "Now, I want to ensure everything is in place for the mortgage restructuring. I'm done being tied to him financially. He has no claim on me or my future." Simone left the lawyer's office with a renewed sense of purpose. The walls that had once confined her were now crumbling away, piece by piece. She no longer needed Ethan. She had everything she needed to rebuild her life. Back at their condo, Ethan was in full-blown panic mode. He had tried everything. He had contacted Marcus, begged Adrienne, and even reached out to his other clients, all in an effort to salvage what little he could. But the walls were closing in on him. The deal was dead, his career was over, and there was no way to spin his actions into something he could escape. His phone rang again, and for a moment, he thought it was Tasha, the one person who seemed to have believed in him even after everything fell apart. But it wasn't her. It was Simone's lawyer, Charles Avery. "Mr. Vance," the lawyer's voice was cold, calculating. "I need to inform you that the paperwork has been finalized. Simone is restructuring the mortgage and filing the necessary claims. You have 72 hours to vacate the property." Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. He had expected some sort of formal notice, but hearing it from Charles Avery, someone who was clearly on Simone's side, made it all the more real. Simone was taking control of everything. His home, his future, and most importantly his pride. The shock of it hit him like a cold wave. His body was frozen for a moment, and he couldn't even process what was happening. Simone was stripping him of everything, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He couldn't fight this. He had no leverage left. He had spent too long focusing on himself, on his own success, to see how much power Simone had quietly built behind the scenes. She wasn't just his wife anymore, she was the one in control. And he was the one on the outside looking in. Ethan spent the next few hours pacing the condo, making frantic phone calls to anyone who would listen. But the truth was, everyone had turned their backs on him. The once popular broker, the man who had swayed clients and manipulated deals, was now an outcast. His calls to Tiffany went straight to voicemail, and when he finally reached her, her tone was cold, uninterested. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said, her voice betraying none of the affection he had once thought she had for him. "You've made your bed. Now you'll have to lie in it." The last shred of his pride shattered in that moment. Tiffany, the woman he had once envisioned as his escape, was gone. She wasn't even pretending to care. She wasn't his confidant anymore. She was just another person who saw him for who he truly was, a man who had failed, a man who had ruined everything for the sake of his own ego. Meanwhile, Simone had already moved on. She wasn't sitting in the apartment, waiting for Ethan to fall apart. She wasn't there for the drama. She was too busy building a future for herself, one that didn't rely on Ethan or his mistakes. She had already secured her new position at Omnistructura, her old company, as a director, but unlike before, this time she was stepping into it with confidence. Without the shadow of Ethan hanging over her, Simone had learned long ago that relying on someone else for your happiness was a mistake. Now she was her own person, strong, self-sufficient, and free from the man who had once defined her existence. The only thing Simone had left to do now was wait. The storm had already passed. Now it was just a matter of watching Ethan realize that his empire had been built on lies, and he had nothing left to fall back on. She was done being the silent observer. Ethan had believed he could control her, manipulate her, and get away with everything, but now he was facing the reality of his own actions. And Simone was no longer the wife standing behind him, she was the one who had taken control. And this was just the beginning. By the time Ethan realized the full extent of what had happened, it was too late. The walls that had once been adorned with luxurious art, that had gleamed with the pride of his success, were now silent witnesses to his collapse. He paced the apartment, his mind a whirl of panic and desperation. Simone had executed her plan with the precision of a master strategist, and there was nothing left for him to hold on to. He had lost everything. Simone, on the other hand, moved forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had long been prepared for this moment. She had already secured her future, and as she sat in her office the next morning, sipping her coffee and reviewing her next steps, she felt the weight of her decisions settle into place. She wasn't looking for a victory over Ethan. She wasn't even interested in the wreckage of their marriage anymore. What she wanted, what she had fought for, was freedom. The shift had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first. But now she could see it clearly. Ethan was a man drowning in his own arrogance, and she was the one who had pulled him under. Ethan's calls to Marcus and Tasha had only gotten more desperate. Every call ended the same way, with the line going cold, with his name disappearing from the list of trusted brokers. He had already tried to offer them a discount, to bribe them into staying with him, but none of his old tricks worked. They were gone, and Ethan was left alone in a crumbling world of his own making. His phone buzzed again. It was Adrienne, his boss. Ethan had been waiting for this call, praying for some kind of reprieve, for someone to give him a lifeline. But the moment he picked up the phone, he knew it was over. Adrienne's voice was sharp, cutting through the phone line like a cold blade. "You're done, Ethan," Adrienne said, his words clipped, devoid of any sympathy. "Do you realize what you've done? The entire office is unraveling because of you. You've endangered every client we've ever had. The deal is dead. The firm is pulling your license." Ethan's head spun. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had worked too hard to let it all slip away. But the more Adrienne spoke, the more it became clear there was no way out. He had burned every bridge, destroyed his reputation, and left Simone with nothing but the ashes of their shared life. "Don't bother coming in tomorrow," Adrienne continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "Your access is revoked. You're finished here. And don't think you're getting another job in this city. Not with what you've done." When Ethan finally ended the call, the apartment felt suffocating. The success, the wealth, the power, it was all gone. And there was no one to blame but himself. He slumped onto the couch, staring at the empty space around him. His suits, his expensive shoes, his perfectly manicured life, all of it felt meaningless now. The once proud broker had become a shadow of his former self, trapped in a world of his own making. The bitter taste of defeat lingered in his mouth, and there was no one to talk to, no one to share his pain with. Meanwhile, Simone was already moving forward. She had packed her things, moved into her new office, and taken control of the narrative. She had left the emotional turmoil behind, knowing that her future would be defined not by the man she had married but by the woman she had become. The phone call she received the next morning was one she had anticipated. It was Ethan, trying once again to salvage whatever was left of their marriage, trying to salvage his ego. "Simone, we need to talk." His voice was shaking, filled with desperation. I know I've messed up. I need you to help me. Please, you're the only one who can fix this. You have to fix this." But Simone wasn't moved. She had already let go, and now she was the one who had the power. She didn't need to hear his apologies, his promises to change. She had heard those excuses for years, and now they meant nothing. "I'm done, Ethan," she said, her voice calm, steady. "I'm done fixing things for you. You made your choices, and now you'll have to live with them. You don't have a place in my life anymore, and you never will again." The finality in her words hit him like a ton of bricks. Ethan tried to speak, to plead, but he could already hear the indifference in her tone. Simone had already closed the door on him, and there was no getting it back open. She had already decided. She was no longer the woman he had left behind. The woman who had tried to fix everything for him. The woman who had spent years waiting for him to change. That woman was gone. And the cold reality was that Ethan wasn't just losing his job, his reputation, or his home. He was losing her. As Simone hung up the phone, a small part of her felt the weight of the years spent in that marriage. But it was no longer a burden. It was the past, and the past was finally behind her. Ethan sat on the couch, the phone in his hand, staring at the blank screen. He had lost Simone, but more than that, he had lost himself. He had spent so many years chasing success, chasing power, that he never once stopped to think about what really mattered. Now everything was slipping away, and there was no one left to blame but himself. Simone had already moved on. Her life was taking shape in ways she had never imagined possible. She had a new job, a new sense of purpose, and a future that was no longer dictated by the failures of the man she had once loved. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the victor. And for Ethan, the man who had once thought he could control everything, the only thing left was the bitter taste of his own failure. This was the moment he realized the truth: his success had never been about the money, the luxury, or the power. It had been about control. And Simone had taken that control back. She had set herself free, and now Ethan was the one left in the cage. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the empty apartment. The space, once a symbol of Ethan's success and prosperity, now felt cold and hollow. The once beautiful decor, the sleek furniture, the art pieces on the walls, they were all just reminders of the life that was slipping away, piece by piece. He had built his empire with charm and manipulation, but now none of that mattered. He was alone, in a space that no longer held any meaning. Ethan had spent the last few days in a haze of confusion, panic, and disbelief. The calls he had made desperate, pleading calls to anyone who might listen, had all been met with silence or polite refusal. His once pristine reputation had been shattered. There was no one left to help him, no one left who cared. And as the reality of his downfall settled in, a sickening sense of emptiness washed over him. He was a man who had everything, who had once been at the top of his game. But now he was the one who had been left behind. The man who had taken everything for granted had nothing left but the wreckage of his own making. Simone, meanwhile, was moving forward. The weight of her past life with Ethan seemed lighter with each passing day. She had already secured her future, carving out a new identity that wasn't defined by the failures of her marriage. Her work as a director at Omnistructura was thriving, and she was gaining the respect and admiration of her colleagues. She wasn't just surviving, she was flourishing, but the most important change was within herself. Simone had learned to trust herself, to believe in her own strength. She no longer needed Ethan to define who she was. She was her own person, standing tall in the world she had built. It wasn't just about the job, the apartment, or the status. It was about Simone reclaiming her life, her peace, and her dignity. She had spent too many years living in the shadow of someone else's ambitions. But now the shadows were gone. Ethan was no longer a part of her world, and she could finally breathe freely. Yet, as she sat in her office, finalizing a new contract, a thought crossed her mind. She had never once sought revenge. No, this wasn't about that. She didn't need to destroy Ethan to feel better. What she had done was much more powerful than any act of retribution. She had simply taken back control of her own life, something Ethan would never understand, but she couldn't help but feel a small pang of satisfaction as she watched Ethan's world collapse. He had underestimated her at every turn, thinking she was weak, predictable. He had thought he could control her forever. But in the end, it was Simone who held the power, and that was something he would never realize until it was too late. As the days passed, Ethan continued to spiral. He couldn't even bring himself to leave the apartment. He was too ashamed to face the world outside. He still had a few friends in the business, but even they had distanced themselves. They knew what had happened. They knew what he had done. And now Ethan was left alone, facing the consequences of his arrogance. The only person who still tried to reach him was Tiffany, but even her sympathy had faded. Her words, once full of flattery and affection, had become curt, dismissive. When he finally managed to get her on the phone, he could hear the coldness in her voice. "Ethan, I'm sorry, but I can't do this," she said. "I don't need someone who's falling apart. I'm not here to fix you. I can't." Her words were like a dagger to his heart. The woman he had once thought was his escape, his prize, was now just another person who had turned her back on him. Ethan realized too late that his pursuit of wealth, success, and status had cost him everything: his marriage, his reputation, and the relationships that once mattered most. Back in her apartment, Simone was making plans for the future. There was still much she wanted to accomplish, and her new role as director was only the beginning. She wasn't interested in looking back at the wreckage of her marriage. She had learned everything she needed to know about Ethan and about herself. The divorce had been a painful process, but now it felt like a distant memory. Simone had made peace with it, just as she had made peace with the fact that she had to leave Ethan behind in order to move forward. Ethan, on the other hand, was stuck in a cycle of denial and self-pity. The city outside his window, which had once been his playground, now seemed like an alien world. He couldn't move, couldn't escape the guilt and the shame that weighed heavily on his chest. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan became a shell of the man he had once been. His clothes no longer fit. His once sleek appearance was now disheveled and unkempt. He had lost weight, his face drawn with exhaustion, and his once charming smile had disappeared entirely. It wasn't until he received a call from his lawyer that Ethan truly understood the full extent of his defeat. The words were blunt, final. The bank had begun the foreclosure process on the condo, and he would have to vacate the premises. It was the last straw. Ethan could no longer deny the truth. He was broken. And the worst part was that he had no one to blame but himself. Meanwhile, Simone was settling into her new life. She had taken up a few new hobbies, started traveling again, and most importantly, she had found peace. The road to recovery had been long, but now it was clear. She was moving forward, leaving the past behind. Her thoughts occasionally wandered back to Ethan, but they no longer held any weight. He was no longer the man she had married, the man she had once loved. He had become a stranger, a reminder of what she had been forced to endure in the name of love. But now, Simone was free. Her life had become something new, something completely different from what she had imagined years ago. She had learned to trust herself again, to follow her instincts, and to never settle for anything less than what she deserved. And in that, she had found true happiness. As she walked into the office, the city skyline stretching out before her, she knew that this was just the beginning. Ethan may have destroyed his life, but she was rebuilding hers, one step at a time, and this time she would never look back. It had been months since Simone had fully distanced herself from Ethan. Her life was becoming everything she had dreamed of. The fresh start she had longed for after years of sacrifice and self-doubt had finally materialized. Every decision she made now was for her. She was no longer tethered to a man who had made her feel small, invisible, and dependent, but even with the distance, the remnants of the past lingered. Ethan's name still appeared in the occasional news article, a reminder of his fall from grace. His once thriving career in luxury real estate was now a cautionary tale of arrogance, excess, and the inevitable collapse that followed. He had made every effort to maintain his dignity in public, putting on a brave face at the few remaining events he was invited to, pretending that everything was fine. But his hollow eyes betrayed him, revealing the emptiness he had been trying to hide. In the quiet of his tiny new apartment, Ethan felt the sting of his complete and utter failure. Gone were the grandiose office spaces, the private dinners, the extravagant gifts he had once lavished on himself. Now he was surrounded by cheap furniture and crumbling walls. The once pristine suits he had worn with pride were now out of place in the rundown space he found himself in. He had tried to make amends, at least in his mind, by calling in favors from his few remaining contacts. But nothing worked. Every door had closed, every phone call ignored. His former colleagues didn't want to be seen with him. Even Tiffany, who had been his latest escape, had disappeared as soon as his financial collapse became public knowledge. One day, as Ethan sat at the small kitchen table, staring blankly at his empty coffee cup, he received a letter. It was from the bank, notifying him that the last of his assets would be liquidated to settle his debts. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle any situation, to turn the tide in his favor. But now it seemed that all the tricks, all the charm, and all the manipulation in the world couldn't save him. His empire, built on lies and false promises, had crumbled, and with it, his identity. He sat there, his hands trembling slightly as he read the letter over and over again, hoping it would change, that somehow there would be a reprieve. But the words were the same every time. Ethan Vance had lost everything. The deal he had tried to pull off, the one he thought would save him, was nothing more than a mirage. Simone, on the other hand, was thriving. As the weeks passed, she continued to rise in her career, establishing herself as a force to be reckoned with in the business world. Her new life was no longer dictated by fear or guilt. She had removed herself from the shackles of a toxic relationship and embraced her power. She had always known she was capable. But it was only after her separation from Ethan that she truly understood what she was capable of. Her friends, colleagues, and even some of the people from her past who had known her as Ethan's wife were now starting to see her in a new light. She was no longer just the supportive spouse standing behind her husband. Simone had become someone they looked up to, a woman who had not only survived betrayal, but had emerged stronger than ever. She had moved into a new, more spacious apartment in a safer neighborhood. The place was a reflection of who she had become, stylish, sophisticated, but most importantly, hers. Every piece of furniture, every piece of decor was chosen with purpose. As if to say, this is my life, and I'm in control of it. Despite everything she had accomplished, Simone occasionally thought about Ethan. She wondered if he had learned anything from his fall. Was he still stuck in his endless cycle of self-doubt and blame? Or had he, in some twisted way, come to terms with his actions? Simone didn't know. And frankly, she didn't care anymore. She had moved on. The past was no longer hers to carry, but when she heard that he had finally been evicted from his condo and was now living in a dilapidated apartment, something inside her stirred. A pang of guilt. No compassion? Maybe a little. But more than anything, it was the realization that he had never understood what she had been trying to say. All those years, Ethan had been so wrapped up in his own world of status, success, and superficial appearances that he never once acknowledged her worth, her dreams, or the sacrifices she had made. Now, he had nothing. And Simone had everything. One evening, as she sat at her desk, reviewing a new business proposal, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. After a moment's pause, she opened the message. It was Ethan. Simone, I need to see you. I can't do this anymore. Please just hear me out. I've lost everything, and I don't know where to go from here. For a brief moment, Simone considered what he had said. He was still the same man, still clinging to the remnants of his old self. the one who had always thought he could manipulate his way out of every situation. But this time, there was no manipulation. There was only the reality of his failure. She stared at the message for a long time, weighing her options. She had already walked away. She had already let go. Was she really going to let him back into her life now? No, she didn't need to hear his excuses. She had heard them all before, and they had never been enough. He had never been enough. Simone typed back, her fingers moving swiftly over the screen. I'm sorry, Ethan, but this time I'm not going to fix it for you. You need to find your own way now. I've already found mine. She pressed send, the weight of the finality of her decision sinking in as the message disappeared into the void. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was at peace. As for Ethan, the message hit him like a slap in the face. There was no more negotiating, no more bargaining. Simone had drawn the line, and this time he couldn't cross it. He sat there in his dark apartment, his phone still in his hand, staring at the screen where her words blinked back at him. Cold and final, the woman who had once been his anchor was now the one who had cut him loose. And this time, there would be no coming back. Simone continued to move forward, a silent victory in her heart. She had been through so much, and now she was living the life she had worked hard to build. The past was over, and with it, the weight of Ethan's failures. The only thing left was her future, and she would live it on her own terms. Weeks turned into months, and as Simone settled further into her new life, the echoes of her past with Ethan faded into the background. Her work continued to flourish, her relationships deepened, and she finally felt at peace with the decision she had made. Every choice she now made was hers alone, no longer tied to the weight of someone else's mistakes. Her success was something she had earned. And it felt empowering in ways she had never experienced before. Simone was no longer defined by her marriage to Ethan. She had built her own identity strong, independent, and unwavering, but even in the midst of her newfound freedom, there were moments of reflection. Moments when she would sit alone in her apartment, looking out over the city skyline, and think back to the life she had once shared with Ethan. It wasn't regret that consumed her, it was a sense of closure. She had been a different person then, living in a world that revolved around him, constantly seeking his approval, waiting for him to love her the way she loved him. Now, she understood that love didn't need validation from anyone. True love started within, and for the first time in years, Simone loved herself. One evening, as she was reviewing a proposal for a new project, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something made her answer. Her heart skipped a beat when the voice on the other end spoke. "Simone, it's Ethan." His voice was different, broken, smaller. The usual arrogance was gone. There was no bravado, no self-assurance. Just a man who had lost everything. For a brief moment, Simone felt something she hadn't expected, sympathy. But only for a moment. "What is it, Ethan?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't angry anymore, but she wasn't going to let him back in. Not like before. She had already given him the chance to change, to take responsibility. He had chosen a different path. I don't know where else to turn. I've lost everything, Simone. My job, my reputation, my friends. I need help, he said, his voice faltering. Simone felt a wave of indifference wash over her. She had been the one who had tried to save him for years, carrying the weight of his failures as if they were her own. But now all she felt was a quiet satisfaction. She had let go. She had learned that she couldn't carry the burden of someone else's mistakes forever. "No, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "You've had every chance to change, to make things right. I can't keep doing this for you. I can't fix you. And I'm not going to try anymore." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She had spent so many years thinking that her love for him was enough to fix everything. She had convinced herself that if she just tried harder, gave more, sacrificed more, he would change. But that wasn't how it worked. She had to fix herself first. She had to rebuild her own life before she could help anyone else. "I've moved on," she continued, her voice soft but resolute. "I'm building my life now. And you. You need to figure things out on your own." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Ethan didn't speak, and for a moment, Simone wondered if he would hang up. But then he whispered, almost inaudibly, "I'm sorry." Simone didn't respond immediately. She wasn't interested in apologies. She had heard them too many times before. This time, the apology didn't matter. The damage had been done. "I hope you find your way, Ethan," she said, her voice final. "But I'm done with this chapter. I'm done with you." She hung up the phone, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over her. It was the closure she had needed. Ethan's sorry words couldn't change the past, and she didn't need them to. Ethan stood there in the empty apartment, the phone pressed to his ear, the silence around him overwhelming. He had expected her to be angry, to yell at him, to demand an explanation. But instead, Simone had been calm, composed. She had told him, without a hint of hesitation, that she was done. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan understood the gravity of it. His life had fallen apart because of his own choices. His arrogance, his lies, and his selfishness had alienated everyone he had ever cared about. He had lost Simone, and that was something he would never get back. The realization hit him hard. Simone had moved on, and he was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered world. The phone call had been his last hope, but now it was clear that there was nothing left for him to salvage. As Simone sat in her office, finishing up her work for the day. She felt a strange sense of liberation. She had let go of the past, and in doing so, she had set herself free. The woman who had once been lost in Ethan's world was now forging her own path. She wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. She wasn't defined by anyone else. She had created her own identity, and she was living it fully. The future was hers to shape, and nothing was holding her back. The phone call from Ethan had been a reminder of just how far she had come. It was a reminder of the woman she had been, the one who had clung to hope in the face of betrayal. But now, the woman who stood before the world was confident, independent, and unshakable. She had learned to trust herself. She had learned that true power came from within. As the evening turned to night, Simone stepped out of her office and into the cool night air. She took a deep breath, the city lights twinkling around her. This was her new beginning. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in her life, she knew she was ready for them, and as she walked down the city streets, head held high, Ethan's shadow no longer loomed over her. She was free, and nothing was going to take that from her. As the days drifted by, Simone continued to navigate her new life with ease. Each day marking another step further away from the woman she had been in the shadow of Ethan. Her career was flourishing. Yes, but it wasn't just about professional success. It was the quieter victories that meant the most to her now. Small moments of peace, freedom, and self-discovery. She had spent so long looking for her worth through someone else's eyes that she had forgotten to look inward. But now every decision, every choice came from her own desires, her own ambitions. Simone was the architect of her own future. Her apartment had transformed into a reflection of who she had become. It wasn't just the sleek, modern furniture or the carefully chosen art on the walls. It was the space that felt like hers in every sense. The walls, once cold and indifferent, now felt warm, alive with possibilities. One of the first things she had done after leaving Ethan was to redecorate her living room. She had replaced the furniture they had picked out together, pieces that no longer held any meaning. It was a fresh start. She had spent days picking out new things, curating a space that felt personal, authentic, and full of life. The process had been symbolic, but it was also freeing. It reminded her that she was capable of creating beauty on her own terms. But Simone knew that success wasn't just about outward appearances or professional milestones. It was about reclaiming the parts of herself she had sacrificed in her marriage, her passions, her interests, her dreams. She had spent so long putting Ethan's goals ahead of hers that she had forgotten what it felt like to put herself first. She started reading again books she had once loved, ones she had put aside in favor of his interests. She took up photography, something she had always wanted to do but never had the time for. Slowly, she was rediscovering who she was outside of the roles that had once defined her. She traveled more, took weekend trips to the coast, visited art galleries, and allowed herself to breathe in the life she had spent years neglecting. Each trip was a reminder that there was so much more to her than she had allowed herself to believe. She was a woman who had dreams, desires, and the freedom to pursue them without waiting for anyone's approval. But even as she flourished, a part of her wondered about Ethan. It wasn't about going back or about feeling any sense of guilt for leaving him behind. It was about understanding whether he had ever truly understood what he had lost. Simone knew that Ethan would never change until he took full responsibility for his actions. Until then, he was doomed to remain in the cycle of self-destruct he had created. And yet, she couldn't help but wonder if, deep down, Ethan had learned anything at all. He had always believed he could control everything, people, situations, his own fate. But now, the fallout from his arrogance was unmistakable. Was it possible that this was the wake-up call he needed? Or had he truly learned nothing? One morning, while sitting at a cafe by herself, sipping her coffee and watching the world go by, Simone received a message that made her stop mid-sip. It was from Marcus, the client Ethan had once worked with on the Stonehaven deal, the deal that had set the chain of events into motion. It had been months since they had last spoken, and Simone had assumed the matter had been put to rest. She glanced at the message, her stomach tightening with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Simone, I need to talk to you." "It's about Ethan." Her fingers hovered over the phone. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hear about Ethan anymore. She had put him out of her mind and closed that chapter for good. But a part of her wondered, was it possible that Marcus had some new information? She typed a quick response, "What about him?" A few minutes later, Marcus replied, his message more urgent than before. "Ethan is trying to start over. He's been coming to the office, meeting with people, trying to rebuild his network. But it's not going well. He's been in contact with me again, asking for advice, asking if I could vouch for him. I'm just letting you know, because you are a huge part of this whole ordeal." Simone put the phone down for a moment, processing what she had just read. Ethan had been trying to rebuild. That was clear. But the question was, did he actually think he could just pick up the pieces of his life as though nothing had happened? Did he truly believe that people, Simone, his colleagues, his former clients, would just forget the lies, the deceit, the years of manipulation? Her mind raced with the realization that Ethan was still trying to rebuild his world on the same foundation of arrogance and deceit. He hadn't changed. He hadn't learned. He was still the man who thought his charm could win back everyone he'd lost. Simone couldn't help but feel a pang of disbelief. After everything, after the lies, the betrayal, the destruction he had left in his wake, he thought he could simply start over, start fresh, without making amends for what he had done. The thought was laughable. But at the same time, Simone felt a fleeting moment of compassion. She had been the one who had tried to save him, who had tried to believe that he could change. But now it was clear that Ethan had no idea what true change looked like. She typed a quick reply to Marcus, her fingers moving with purpose. "Tell him to keep trying. But I don't think anyone is going to buy what he's selling anymore." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "And tell him that if he's truly serious about change, he needs to start by facing the truth. No more lies, no more shortcuts." Marcus replied almost immediately, thanking her for her honesty. She put her phone down again, taking a deep breath. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It wasn't about taking pleasure in Ethan's downfall. It was about recognizing that Ethan had to make his own choices now. Simone couldn't fix him, and frankly, she no longer wanted to. As the weeks went on, Simone found herself more deeply immersed in her own life. There were no more thoughts of Ethan creeping into her mind. She was no longer burdened by the weight of their past. Every day was an opportunity to move forward, to embrace the woman she had become, and then one day, while enjoying a quiet afternoon at a park, she saw a familiar figure in the distance. Ethan. He was sitting on a bench, his face gaunt, his posture slumped. His once confident presence was now a shadow of its former self. For a moment, their eyes met, and time seemed to stop. Simone couldn't help but notice the look of defeat in his eyes, the emptiness that seemed to consume him, but she didn't approach. She didn't say anything. This was no longer her fight. Ethan had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. Simone had learned that sometimes the best way to help someone was to let them go, to allow them to face the consequences of their actions. With one final glance at the man who had once been her world, she turned and walked away. The past was gone. The future was hers, and she was no longer waiting for anyone to join her. The days after that chance encounter in the park passed in a blur. Simone had seen Ethan, but she hadn't approached him. She hadn't spoken to him. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt truly free. It was a quiet freedom, one that wasn't marked by grand gestures or bold declarations, but by a deep, inner peace that came from knowing she had made the right choices. Her life was her own now. It was a life she had built from the ground up, brick by brick, without the weight of Ethan's failures hanging over her. She was no longer tied to the narrative of their shared past. She had stepped out of the shadow, into the light, and she wasn't going back. Work continued to be a fulfilling part of her life. Simone's new role as director at Omnistructura gave her a sense of purpose and accomplishment. She had earned this position through her hard work, her intelligence, and her unwavering belief in her own abilities. Every day, she worked alongside talented colleagues who respected her not because of her past, but because of who she was now. She was seen for the first time as a leader, as someone who commanded respect. Her mornings were filled with meetings and strategy sessions. But it wasn't just the business side of things that kept her engaged. She had grown to love the human element of her work, the way she connected with people, helped them grow, and made a real impact. Simone wasn't just managing projects. She was creating change, both in the company and within herself. Yet, there were still moments of quiet reflection. There were still nights when she lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the past. Not out of longing, not out of regret, but as a way to ensure she never forgot how far she had come. She thought about Ethan occasionally, but it wasn't the kind of thought that pulled her back. It wasn't the kind of thought that made her wonder if she had made the wrong decision. It was a realization of how much she had grown and how far she had moved beyond him. And then one day, she received an email that stopped her in her tracks. It was from Marcus. The subject line read, "Ethan has reached out again. He wants to talk." Simone paused, reading the message over and over again. After everything, after the phone calls, the messages, the apologies he had made to everyone but her, now Ethan wanted to talk. She hesitated. A part of her wanted to respond, wanted to hear what he had to say, perhaps to get some sense of closure, to understand if there was truly anything left in him to redeem. But another part of her, the part that had moved on, the part that had rebuilt her life without him, knew better. She had already given him more than enough chances. Still, the curiosity lingered. After a moment of silence, Simone typed a quick reply, "Tell him I have nothing to say." She didn't have to think about it for long. She wasn't angry at Ethan anymore. She wasn't upset. She was just done. Her response was final, a decision that she had made long ago. Ethan would never truly understand what he had lost. But she had learned, through all the pain and the heartbreak, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was to simply walk away. And that was what she had done. Ethan was not the man he once was. He had learned, in the hardest way possible, that life was unforgiving when you tried to manipulate it. But even then, it seemed he wasn't fully prepared to accept the consequences. It wasn't that he didn't regret what he had done to Simone, but he still clung to the belief that he could somehow fix everything. Somehow convince her that he was worthy of a second chance. In the months that followed, he had tried to put his life back together. He'd made small strides to rebuild his career. Although it was clear that his reputation would never be the same, he still had his moments of despair, moments when the weight of his mistakes threatened to crush him. But there were others when he felt the faintest glimmer of hope, believing that if he worked hard enough, if he tried long enough, things would change. But Simone was no longer part of that equation. She had made peace with everything he had put her through, and she had let go in the most profound way possible. She had chosen herself, and in doing so, she had become someone unrecognizable to the woman she once was. She wasn't the one who needed fixing anymore. Life went on. Simone continued to rise, thriving in her career and building deeper, more meaningful relationships with the people around her. She had become a mentor to those in her team, someone they could look up to not just for her skills, but for the way she carried herself. She had turned every hardship into strength and used every challenge as fuel to drive her forward. Then, one day, months after her last exchange with Ethan, Simone found herself at a crossroads. She had received an invitation to an event, a gala celebrating the achievements of women in business. It was an event she had been considering attending, but it was also a chance to be around old colleagues, old faces from her past life. Some of those people still knew her as Ethan's wife. The thought of being in the same room as the people who had once known her through Ethan made her feel uneasy for a moment. But then, as she sat at her desk, reviewing the invitation, something clicked. It was time to stop letting the past dictate her future. She had already moved on in her heart, but perhaps it was time to make that final step to step into the world as Simone. Fully, unapologetically, and without looking back, the night of the gala arrived, and Simone walked into the ballroom with her head held high, feeling more confident than ever before. As she scanned the room, she could see the people who had once underestimated her, people who had seen her as nothing more than an accessory to Ethan. But tonight, she was the one commanding attention. She had earned every ounce of the respect that was now afforded to her. For the first time in years, Simone felt the weight of Ethan's shadow lift completely from her. She wasn't just attending this event as someone's wife. She was attending as a woman who had fought for her place and earned it. At the end of the night, as she stood on the balcony, overlooking the city below, she felt a sense of satisfaction that she hadn't felt in a long time. She had made it, not just professionally, but personally. She was whole, and that was all that mattered. As she stood there in the glow of the city lights, she realized that this was the true beginning, the start of the life she had always dreamed of. The life she had fought for. And as the cool night air wrapped around her, Simone understood that while the past would always be a part of her story, it no longer defined her. She was no longer the woman she had been. She was the woman she had always been meant to become. It had been several months since the last conversation with Ethan, and in many ways, Simone felt like a completely different person now. The days had a flow to them that felt easy, unburdened. She had created a life for herself that was rooted in authenticity, one where she no longer second-guessed her choices or doubted her worth. She had learned that happiness wasn't something that could be given or taken from you, it was something you had to claim for yourself. Her career was thriving, but it was her personal growth that mattered most. She had finally become the woman she was always meant to be, not the partner of someone else, not the reflection of someone else's ambitions, but a woman who had finally realized the immense power that resided within her. She had stepped out of the darkness of her past and into the light of her own potential. It was an ordinary Wednesday when Simone got an unexpected email, one she wasn't sure she wanted to read, but one she felt compelled to open. The subject line read, "New opportunity, your next chapter." The email was from Omnistructurer, offering her a new position, a promotion to head of strategy. It was a huge leap, one that would place her in charge of some of the most important decisions for the company. It was everything she had worked toward, and yet, as she stared at the words on the screen, she felt a strange stillness inside her. She was no longer rushing toward the next goal with the same fervor she once had. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the offer, it was that she had finally come to understand that her value didn't lie in her titles or her accomplishments. Her value was within her. Still, she couldn't deny the part of her that had worked tirelessly for this moment, that had sacrificed so much to prove to herself that she was worthy. This was the reward of those efforts. After much consideration, Simone accepted the position. But this time she did it for herself, not as a way to compensate for past failures or to prove something to the world. She accepted because she knew she had earned it, and she was ready to take on a leadership role in a way that would empower others as much as it empowered her. That evening, she sat down with a glass of wine on her balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She had worked so hard for this. And now she was truly at peace. Life began to shift in subtle ways after her promotion. Simone took more time for herself, carving out space to breathe, to enjoy the small moments that used to pass her by when she was so consumed with what came next. She spent weekends hiking, visiting art galleries, and hosting dinners with friends, people who truly saw her, who knew her. She had cultivated a community that was real, not based on expectations or what others thought she should be. It was a place of acceptance, where she could just be Simone. She was also learning the delicate art of self-care. She joined yoga classes, picked up journaling, and spent quiet evenings reading books she'd always wanted to get lost in. There were days when she didn't think about Ethan, and that felt like a victory. The truth was, Ethan had been a significant part of her life, but he no longer controlled the narrative. She had written her own story now, and that story was one of resilience, strength, and above all self-love. One weekend, Simone decided to take a solo trip to the coast. It had been years since she had gone away alone, without anyone else to consider. She stayed in a charming little beach house, tucked away from the world. The ocean's waves were constant, soothing, and she spent her days walking along the shore, reading, and taking photos of the stunning sunsets. It was the kind of trip that allowed her to pause and reflect on everything she had overcome. During one of her evening walks on the beach, she encountered a group of people sitting around a bonfire. They were strangers, but there was something warm and inviting about their laughter, so she found herself gravitating toward them. After a few moments of friendly conversation, one of the women offered her a seat by the fire. The group talked about everything from the beauty of the coast to the books they had read, to the future they were all building for themselves. It felt like the universe had given her another reminder of how much she had gained, not in terms of material success, but in the richness of her relationships, the new connections she was making. She felt a sense of belonging that had eluded her for years. For the first time in ages, she realized how much she had grown on the second night of her stay. As she watched the flames dance in the firelight, Simone felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of possibility, not for her career or for the next promotion, but for her life. There was so much to explore, so much more to learn. The world was full of opportunities, full of people who could help her continue to grow, but most importantly, it was full of experiences she had yet to discover. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to let go of the future she had been so obsessed with. Instead, she embraced the present, the moments of beauty, peace, and spontaneity. The firelight flickered in her eyes, and she realized that she wasn't just looking for a new beginning. She had already created it, back in the city. As Simone returned to her daily routine, there was a subtle shift in her perspective. The work, the success, the recognition, none of it had the same hold over her anymore. She was proud of her achievements, of course, but now she knew that the real success was in how she had managed to come out of a turbulent past and carve a life for herself that was truly hers. One afternoon, she sat at her desk, her gaze resting on the skyline through the office window. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from a friend, inviting her to another event in a few weeks. Simone smiled and, for a moment, wondered how much had changed since she first began this journey. Her life was her own now, and she was in control. No longer bound by the expectations of others, no longer confined by the limitations of her past. She had embraced the fullness of who she was, and there was no going back. For the first time in years, Simone realized that she had built not just a life, but a future that was entirely her own, a future filled with joy, freedom, and endless possibilities. And with that, Simone knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The air was crisp as Simone walked through the park on an early Sunday morning, her hands tucked in the pockets of her jacket. She had always been someone who found solace in the simplicity of nature, the rhythmic rustle of leaves in the breeze, the sound of birds chirping, and the sight of the world waking up. These moments gave her a sense of peace she hadn't known before, and over time, she had come to cherish them more than anything else. Her life had become an intricate balance between work and personal fulfillment, between ambition and self-care. She had built this balance through years of trial and error, of learning to set boundaries and prioritize herself. The woman who once lived in the shadows of someone else's expectations was now living in the full light of her own desires. As she walked past the fountain in the park, she reflected on how much had changed. She had let go of the need to chase approval or to prove herself to anyone, especially to Ethan. There had been a time when her worth had been tied to how much she could give to others, how much she could sacrifice. But now she understood that her value came from within. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus. "Simone, there's something I think you should know. Ethan reached out to me again. He's decided to leave the city for good. He's been moving through the final steps of his reinvention. I think he might be genuinely trying to make a change this time, but he needs to let go of his past to do that. He's asked if I could put you two in touch one last time." Simone stared at the message, her heart momentarily still. Ethan was leaving. For good this time. It seemed surreal, like a chapter closing, one that she had long since left behind, but there was something about Ethan's request that made her pause. Could it be that he was finally seeing things for what they truly were? Could he finally understand the toll his actions had taken, not just on their marriage, but on himself? Simone didn't know. She didn't know if there was any room left in her heart for him, or even if there was any need for closure anymore. She had already moved forward. Her life had already shifted in a direction she hadn't even known she needed. After a long pause, she typed a reply to Marcus. "Thank you for letting me know, Marcus. But I think it's time to leave the past where it belongs. I don't think talking again would do either of us any good. I found my peace, and I think Ethan needs to find his in his own way." With that, she hit send, not with any lingering emotions, but with the quiet certainty that she had made the right choice. She didn't need Ethan's apology, and she didn't need to revisit their past. Simone had already healed. The following week, Simone threw herself into a new project at work. It was a massive undertaking, one that had the potential to be a game changer for the company. She was energized, inspired, and ready to take on the challenge. The project was something that not only excited her, but also aligned with her values. It was a chance to use her influence to make a real difference, to shape the future of the business in a way that had meaning. but it wasn't just work that kept her moving forward. Simone had learned how to savor the little things: laughter with friends over dinner, long conversations with her parents, a quiet afternoon spent reading on the balcony. She had found a new rhythm, one that allowed for both success and joy without sacrificing either. One evening, while at a dinner with a close friend, Simone was asked a question that made her pause. They had been talking about everything from work to relationships to travel, and suddenly, her friend asked, "Do you ever think about the life you would have had if things with Ethan had worked out?" The question caught Simone off guard. For a moment, she didn't know how to answer. She had spent so much time healing and growing that thinking back to that part of her life felt like opening an old wound. But then she realized something. "No," Simone said, her voice steady. "I don't think about it anymore. I don't need to. The life I have now is the one I've built, and it's exactly what I need. I don't want to go back to who I was then. I've finally become the person I was meant to be." Her friend smiled, clearly impressed by the clarity in her voice. But it wasn't just the words, it was the certainty, the peace that radiated from her. Simone had finally made peace with her past, and it had freed her in ways she couldn't have imagined. A few months later, Simone sat in her office, reviewing the final stages of the project that had taken months to bring to fruition. It had been one of the most challenging, but rewarding, experiences of her career. But as she sat there, a feeling of contentment washed over her. It wasn't the accolades, the praise, or the recognition that filled her with pride. It was the knowledge that she had done it on her own terms. The phone rang, and Simone picked it up, expecting a call from her assistant with updates about a meeting. But when she heard the voice on the other end, it wasn't who she was expecting. Simone. It was Ethan. His voice sounded different this time. Softer, quieter, almost vulnerable. "Ethan?" she asked, surprised to hear from him after all this time. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, "for everything. For giving me the space to grow. I know I hurt you, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I just want you to know that I've changed. I've worked hard to become the man I should have been for you all those years ago." For a long moment, Simone was silent. She had long forgiven him. Forgiveness wasn't something she needed from him, it was something she had already given herself. But hearing him acknowledge his mistakes was something she hadn't expected. Finally, she spoke. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Ethan, but I'm okay now. I've built my own life, and I'm finally at peace." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Ethan sighed softly. "I'm glad you found your peace, Simone." "I really am." After the call ended, Simone sat back in her chair, letting the weight of the conversation sink in. It wasn't the closure she had expected, but it was the closure she had needed. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about her. Simone had moved on, and she was finally free. Later that night, as she walked through the park again, the moonlight reflected on the surface of the pond, casting a soft glow across the water. She paused for a moment, watching the ripples spread across the surface. Life, like water, was constantly shifting, moving forward, changing, growing, but she had found her center, and nothing could take that away from her.